And I know the mayor has set a standard for he wants to get rid of diabetes in this community. And I think one of the best examples of a leader doing that for us in this country, once again, was right here in the great state of Texas in 1962. President John F. Kennedy gave a speech at Rice University, and he said, "We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, because it is hard. Because that goal will organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one that we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win." In 1962, how many times throughout the course of that decade did we have rockets that blew up on the launch pad or fell out of the sky? And how many other things were happening in the 60s that could have undermined that goal of getting to the moon at the end of this decade, of the Soviets building up their arms race, and of racial tension and funding? And how much pride did this country feel in 1969 when we put a man on the moon with just 6 months to spare? Now, I've set a few goals that had some failure potential. I remember the first time, after a few years of having diabetes, I was just sort of a regular guy, and I decided that I wanted to run a marathon. And I figured, if I'm going to run a marathon, I'm going to do it and raise money for a diabetes charity, and they're going to send me to Hawaii, and I'd run this marathon out there in Hawaii. And so I figured, if I'm going to run a marathon, I might as well do it in a place that I want to be when I finish. So I'm out there in Hawaii. I'd never run a marathon before. I didn't know a whole lot about distance running, and I just wanted to see if I could accomplish it with type 1 diabetes. And it was 26.2 of the most miserable, excruciating, hot, wonderful miles of my entire life, because I had never run a marathon. And I remember crossing the finish line of that marathon, and I didn't do very well, but I did okay. And I'm sitting there, and it's about 900 degrees in Hawaii, and I'm feeling absolutely miserable and ecstatic, because I had just run a marathon with type 1 diabetes. As I'm sitting there, I'm laying down there at the finish line, and other people kind of come in across the finish line, and there's this guy, he's sitting there next to me, and he says, "You know, this is where they run the Ironman triathlon. Those guys, they swim 2.5 miles out there in the Pacific Ocean. Then they bike 112 miles up there to Hawaii and back. And then they run this marathon." And I leaned over to that guy, and I threw up. What kind of freak of fitness swims 2.5 miles, bikes 112 miles, and then runs a marathon? And who can do that with type 1 diabetes? But right then, I had another goal. I had another goal with a lot more failure potential. I'm going to do the Ironman. I'm going to do the Ironman with type 1 diabetes. And for 2 years, I worked for that goal. I had a new goal, and I did other triathlons, shorter triathlons. I ran other marathons until 2 years later, I crossed the finish line of my very first Ironman triathlon. And I was very proud of myself. And I remember being at the finisher's banquet the next day after that Ironman, and I'm feeling pretty good. I'm not feeling pretty good. I'm feeling darn good, because I was an Ironman. And then I started hearing the race announcer, the MC, call out some of the times of the people who had finished tops in their divisions and tops in the race and qualifying for the World Championships. And I started hearing some of the times that these people did this Ironman triathlon. And they did it 2 hours faster than I did. I mean, 2 hours. I mean, they had enough time to cross the finish line, get a shower, go to a movie, drop by Starbucks, turn a few emails, and come watch my sorry sack of flesh come stumbling across the finish line. But right then, I had another goal. I'm going to be one of those guys. I'm going to be on that stage. I'm going to be one of the best in the world. And I'm going to do it with type 1 diabetes. Now, I had a new goal. I had to change the way that I was doing things. You know, there's a definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. It's true for people that are trying to deal with diabetes. if you keep eating the same things, you don't exercise, you don't change your insulin delivery systems, you're going to get the same results. And it's the same for us in other life, or whatever goal you're trying to achieve. Why do I always end up in this situation? Well, if you try to change anything, I got a better bike. I hired a coach. I started taking swim technique lessons. I started doing different workouts, different training. To get to that point that I left you just a while ago when I was at mile 13 of that marathon, mile 127 of that Ironman triathlon, and I was on pace to cut 2 hours off my time and be one of the best in the world. Now, whenever you do something like that and you start setting goals for your community or the people that you're leading or for yourself, you know, you're going to be perhaps subject to some criticism or to some skepticism or to some questioning. And I'm sure you've all felt that, those of you who've tried to do that for yourself or those that you're leading. You know, Mark Twain said that 20 years from now, you'll be more disappointed by the things you didn't do than by the things you did. And high achievers understand that. And I'd like to give some advice to the politicians in this room and all of us that 100 years ago, President Teddy Roosevelt told us how we should deal with the critics in our life. He gave a speech at the Sorbonne University in Paris in 1910, and that was 2 world wars, a real Great Depression, an atomic bomb, and all the things in society that have changed since then, but those words still are true today. And he said, it's not the critic who counts. It's not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or how the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man or woman in the arena, whose face is marred by blood and sweat and dust, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes up short again and again, because there's no great effort without some shortcoming, who spends himself toward a worthy cause, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who at best knows the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, so that his fate will never rest with those cold and timid souls who've known neither victory nor defeat. Ladies and gentlemen, don't let your fate rest with those cold and timid souls who've known neither victory nor defeat. Don't be afraid of failure. Don't be afraid to try to achieve something, to try to cure this disease, to try to rid this community of diabetes, or whatever it is in your life that you want to achieve. I'll tell you this story, and then I'll close with this. I left you a while ago, and I was at mile 13 of that marathon, mile 127 of that Ironman triathlon. I'd been racing for about 7.5 to 8 hours at that point. The temperature was about 85 or 90 degrees, and I was really in a lot of pain, but I was on pace to be one of the best in the world, the point that I wanted to be, that I'd worked so hard to be. And I had a miserable year up to that point. It started out with racing an Ironman triathlon in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, my first one that year in the spring. And I had a great race out there. I had a good swim, I had a good bike, but I got to the marathon and I started struggling on the marathon out there in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and my pace was slow, and over the course of the marathon I started getting slower and slower, and people were starting to catch me, and finally I collapsed at mile 18 of that marathon. And the medics had to carry me off the course and into the medical tent. And I remember laying there in the medical tent just wondering what happened, what did I do wrong? And I was so dehydrated, and my nutrition had just gotten off during the course of that race. And I had a tear in my eye laying there in the medical tent, and I had to get on a plane the next day and fly to Sweden. That was my first year on the U.S. national team, and I was meeting up with the U.S. team, and we were racing the World Championships in Sweden, and I was doing 2 Ironman triathlons in 6 days on different continents of the globe. It's not the best schedule in the world, but it's one that they gave me that year, and I was so beat up, and I got there, and I did okay, but I was kind of in the middle of the pack, and I mean, it was the World Championship, but I finished kind of in the middle of the field, and I didn't do as well as I wanted to do and how I thought I could do, and I came back to the U.S., and I did another Ironman up in Madison, Wisconsin, and it was the same thing. I had a really good swim, a great bike. I got out on the marathon after about 5 or 6 miles of the marathon. I started feeling a little queasy. I ended up throwing up. And then I ended up throwing up again and again. And after about 5 or 6 times, I couldn't run, and I had to walk the last 18 miles of that marathon. But I was not going to be denied that finish line. And I finished deep in the night, back with the amateurs in the field, but I was not, if I had to walk 18 miles, I was going to walk it to get to that line. So here I am now, and it's November of that year, my 4th Ironman triathlon of the year, and I am at mile 13, and I am on pace. Everything is going right, and I'm starting to hurt really bad, and I know those good runners are behind me, and they're going to be catching me at any moment. And the miles 14, 15, 16, and I know that the guys are coming. At mile 20, I don't know that if I can go any further at this pace. I've only got a measly 10K to go, another 6 miles. I've gone 134 miles, and right at that point, 2 athletes passed me, a guy from Germany and a guy from the US. And those are those good runners that are in the field. And I knew they were back there behind me, and I got ahead of them on the bike, and I just wanted to reach out and just grab hold of their jerseys as they went by me and just latch on to their pace. And so I got in behind them, and I started running with them. Mile 21, mile 22, mile 23. I'm at mile 137 of the Ironman triathlon. I've only got 3 more miles to go, and I'm getting back into the city center where the people are lining the route, and they're screaming and they're yelling, and I cannot keep this pace up any longer. My heart was in my throat. I had tears in my eyes. My blood sugar had dropped now. I know because I checked it after the race. It was down below 70. I'm thinking, I cannot keep this pace up. And right at that moment, out of the crowd, I saw my coach. And he stuck his head out and said one thing to me as I went by. How bad do you want it? How bad do you want it? I wanted it for all the 10,000 times I had stuck myself with a syringe 5, 6, 7, 8 times a day. All the 50,000 times I had been checking my blood sugar and will be checking my blood sugar and pricking my finger. I wanted it for that one moment in time where I could be more than I thought I could be that day in the hospital with tubes in my arms and in my nose, and they told me I had diabetes and I may eventually lose my foot or lose my leg. I wanted it for all the families that I speak to that have children with diabetes or have diabetes themselves and say, can I be what I want to be? Can my daughter, can my son grow up and do whatever they want to be? And for the people that I speak to that are dealing with something in their life that says, I don't know if I can take this and overcome this. I raced to that line with those 2 guys for the next 3 miles. I got to the last 100 meters of that Ironman triathlon. It is just like my finish line vision has always been. The people were sticking their hands out, and I was slapping them as I went by. The music was playing, the noise and the intensity, the photographers, the lights, the cameras, the race announcer was saying from the United States of America, and I crossed the finish line in 9 hours and 47 minutes and 14 seconds. 2 hours faster than I had just 2 years before. I was now one of the best in the world. And I collapsed in the arms of the officials there at the finish line, and they carried me into the medical tent. Seems like I always end up in the medical tent. And they laid me down on a cot, and they put an IV in my arm and began to rehydrate me with fluid. And I remember sitting there on that medical bed with a tear in my eye and IVs in my arms and thinking about the circle of life, about how the worst day of my life, I was laying in a hospital bed with IVs in my arms and a tear in my eye, and I couldn't lift my head when they told me that I had diabetes. And now that had been my motivation, and this was now one of the best days at that point of my life, that I'm still laying there with IV in my arm and a tear in my eyes, and it had become my motivation to get to this point. Ladies and gentlemen, make the bad thing that happens to you, the difficulty you face, the best thing that's ever happened to you. Don't be afraid to fail, and get to the line. Get to the starting line, and you will get to your finish line. You may not be the fastest, but you'll be faster than those who quit or never started. Thank you so much for all that you're doing for this disease and for being here today.